A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
A conversation coming over this next hour. I'm going to just hold off for a few minutes while we lay a foundation, but I would love if you were able to make your own contribution. You might have your own perception about what's happening in these times, because these times are changing and there may be some rough and difficult terrain ahead on the journey for Christians and churches. And as a Christian, you'll know that a woke secular age is having an effect on how Christian believers talk about issues like faith, family, or freedom. Well, our special guest today says our legal situation has become more difficult in recent years. And he is a legal expert. He says it's time to understand what it is to be wise as serpents and as innocent as doves in the way we seek to maintain our Christian identity and values. Well, a privilege today to tap into the wisdom of one of Australia's prominent legal minds, with insights into how Christians navigate what it is in this more hostile legal environment that we face. Our special guest today is Emeritus Professor Patrick Parkinson, a former Dean of Law at the University of Queensland. He is an expert in family law, child protection, and is a long-time advocate for religious freedom. He's just released an important new book. It's called Unshaken Allegiance: Living Wisely as Christians with Diminishing Religious Freedoms. Professor Patrick Parkinson, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Patrick, let's start at what I might think is an unusual place to start, but there's some things about your own personal history that have prepared you to speak with authority on something like this. Let's go back to your early studies, learning about law, and you found yourself behind the Iron Curtain in Bratislava, in what is now called Slovakia. Then it was Czechoslovakia, back in the early 1980s. Take us back to the sorts of things you were exposed to in your early years.
So, Neil, I finished a law degree at a university in England, and I felt called by the Lord to go and live in Czechoslovakia for a 9-month period. I'd met a couple of Slovak Christians at a conference, and I went and I joined their church. It was an evangelical church, and I spent nine months living as they did, with incredible restrictions on religious freedom. They could go to church, but they paid a price for going to church. They paid a price for being Christians. They were barred from certain jobs. They couldn't get the jobs that they wanted. Life could be very tough for them, and it was a privilege to be part of that experience.
Well, you survived it, and so let's just touch on some things here. You were a British Council scholar in socialist family law under the Educational Exchange Agreement between the UK and Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe. Were they trying to sell you the benefits and all of the wonderful virtues of socialism while you were there as the exchange student?
No, they weren't. And indeed, I was in the law faculty, in the family law division of it. I remember buying a book once, which was in English and had some stuff about the communist regime. And the head of the department said, "Oh, Patrick, you shouldn't be reading that. That's propaganda." So, by that stage, they were quite disillusioned themselves, honestly, with the socialist system. But the reason why there was an exchange agreement was because it was part of UNESCO's work in encouraging educational exchange. And essentially, each Soviet bloc country could send 7 people to England, to Oxford or LSE or Bristol University or wherever. And in return, the British could send 7 people to Romania or Bulgaria or wherever. let's just say it wasn't a fair exchange, but I didn't have great difficulty in getting a scholarship in those circumstances.
Now, while you were there, so we're talking behind the Iron Curtain, we're talking communism reigns. There were other countries in those Eastern Bloc countries in Europe, like Poland, that were imposing martial law. This was sort of a normal thing behind the Soviet, the Iron Curtain, that this is the way people are controlled and managed. Describe what that might have been like back in those days.
Look, it was a very tough environment. I was about 1 kilometre from the Iron Curtain, from the barbed wire and the patrolled areas. I heard gunshots occasionally at night. You lived in fear. You never knew, Neil, who you could trust. That was one of the things. The person sitting next to you in church may well be an informer. And I had to learn the whole time to guard my words. Of course I had friends. Of course I trusted them. But one had to be careful with people you didn't know so well, who might appear to be safe, but in fact weren't. They were reporting back to the secret police.
You were a young man, and you did link in with an evangelical church, as you say. There's an effect, isn't there, when that sort of socialist regime is in power, on people of faith? Trust is one of the issues. What are the other issues that happen when you are a Christian believer and where socialism gains this sort of power?
You have to be prepared to pay a price to be a believer, and every believer did. And that price could vary, obviously, from one to the other. It certainly affected their jobs and their choices of careers. For some, it could mean imprisonment. It didn't for the great majority. Let's be clear. But you always had to be aware of the risk of some sort of retribution for being a person of faith, and that meant that their faith was very committed and very, very strong. I had connections with a Catholic underground movement, which was quite extraordinary. The risks that they took in the name of the gospel was inspiring.
Now, you were free to worship, and, sometimes we talk about religious freedom, and there might be a way that a socialism view has of that. Of course, you can do whenever you like behind those four walls, but just don't say anything publicly. And that was no doubt the way that it worked back under a socialist regime then. And we might even be feeling as though that's something that we're being pushed towards today. Are you seeing similarities?
I want to be clear that we're in no way in the same situation as my brothers and sisters were in Eastern Europe. Not at all. But there is some convergence. There are signs of similar things happening. And you see this, for example, in the way in which many Christians, I think, feel very reluctant to be open as believers from Monday to Friday. That their faith is something confined to the weekends, to their church life, but they're afraid to be open about their faith. And that comes from the sorts of pressures that we are now seeing. I think we're also seeing laws, this is a point of my book, being weaponized or capable of being weaponized against people of faith. The laws become more hostile in some respects.
Back in those days, there were students who had to meet secretly for Bible study groups. And, that sort of secretive nature means you're taking a risk to meet together. And I take what you say, we're nowhere near that. But there are some signs that, if there's an end result of where things go, that may well be the sort of pressure that Christian believers could be under. Now, let me know if I'm exaggerating there, but, the idea of secret believers, is this something that you ought to even be thinking about today as to how you are open with the the way that you meet together with believers so that you're not drawing a big attention to yourself, particularly if you are saying things about family, faith and freedom that may put you under some level of pressure.
That's exactly right. I think a lot of people self-censor, particularly in the workplace, and sometimes that's the right thing to do. We're not here to cause disruption or to upset people or offend people. We have jobs to do, we should get on and do them. But for example, I've always taken the view in my work, teaching for 40 years in universities, that I would be quite open about being a Christian. I never would use the classroom to proselytize for a particular point of view. Never. I thought that's absolutely wrong to abuse your position like that. I'd express a view and I'd invite other people to express theirs. But I did find so many of my students who told me that it was a comfort and support to them to know that I was openly a Christian and holding a position of responsibility and in some cases power in the university world.
And certainly we honour you for that openness and for that courage to be able to remain a Christian believer and be open about that. And you know what? There's an encouragement just in hearing your own testimony in that we ought not to self-censor and close down our faith just because we feel like there's a risk of being cancelled, because that's one of the issues today, isn't it? So a self-censorship, and maybe is there a pendulum here? Maybe does the self-censorship go too far and then we realise that, wait a minute, we've over-self-censored, we might need to find some middle ground. Any thoughts there?
I think we need to recognise that there are pressures on us where people are wanting to us to self-censor, to put our faith in the closet. I experienced that at the University of Sydney, significant opposition to me because I was a public Christian. Now, you can either give in to that, and then that may benefit your career, or you can say, no, here I stand, not in a confrontational way, but to say, my faith is central to my life, it's central to what I do. If you want to bring your whole self to work, that's great, but I should be able to as well.
Let's talk law. You're an expert in law, and you've been observing the way things have been changing here in Australia. Back in those days in Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain, the law was undistinguishable from the government. We like to talk about a separation of church and state, and some people have all sorts of different ideas what that means. What's been changing, Patrick, in our law that we might need to be aware of so that we're just, being wise as serpents and as innocent as doves?
A lot of the pressures that we are experiencing come from anti-discrimination law, and related to anti-discrimination law is anti-vilification or hate speech provisions, things of this kind. It's not the entirety, but it's a lot of it. And just to explain a little bit about that, Neil, Christians have been at the forefront of anti-discrimination laws. You may remember a man called Reverend Martin Luther King,
yes,
who was the leader of the civil rights movement, a man of enormous courage and a deeply Christian man. Jesus revolutionized society by his emphasis on the equality of men and women and slaves and free Jews and Gentiles, and Paul took that up as well. So anti-discrimination law, equality, treating people with dignity, treating people with respect is a really important part of what it means to be a Christian. But there are areas where anti-discrimination law has expanded and expanded and expanded in ways that threaten the practice of our faith. Good example, in Victoria and Tasmania, it is against the law to discriminate on the basis of lawful sexual conduct. Now think about those words, lawful sexual conduct. Prostitution is lawful. Going on some of these websites where you sell your body for money, that's lawful. A youth worker sleeping with every adult woman in the young adults group is lawful, but none of those things are Christian. But for exemptions that we have had for a long time in anti-discrimination laws, we would be subject to civil suits for, quote, discriminating against somebody who was engaging in lawful sexual conduct. Now, those exemptions have long protected us, but there's been a lot of pressure to remove or eliminate those exceptions, and I believe that they really shouldn't exist. So that's been one of the pressures. Another one is hate speech. Now, we've long had laws, and rightly so, that says you should not use words to incite violence against others. Of course that is so. But increasingly these hate speech laws have been drafted in such a vague way that they are really used against ideas that people happen to hate. It's not hate speech that is inciting violence or harm to others. It's simply, I don't like the ideas you're expressing, and therefore that is hate speech. And we're seeing this happening in Australia.
Life, culture, and current events from a biblical perspective.
You know, to be a lawyer, Patrick, going to law school in those days meant being in good standing with the Communist Party. Being in bad standing with the Communist Party might have meant that you were not able to pursue law because, you know, those sorts of things were at the whim of whoever was in power. Let's talk about power here and get your impressions about our status here in Australia. We talk about a separation of powers that gives us some level of protection. Is our status, is our protection in any sort of risk at all of changing?
Neil, just to refer to Czechoslovakia again for a moment, my friends could not understand how I could be a Christian and a lawyer. I mean, they were completely incompatible occupations because you could not be a Christian and ever be accepted as a lawyer because law was an instrument of government. Now, we are fortunate that is not the case in the Western world. It's not the case in Australia. And the independence of the judiciary is absolutely fundamental to that. The government may be in a case against an individual and the government may lose that case. That's the fundamentals of the rule of law, that it restrains what governments can do. So, no, I think we're in a good position. And the law can sometimes be in our favour to defend us. If I may give an example, there was an extraordinary situation in England a few years ago where there was a big debate about same-sex marriage, and as we had in Australia as well. And a Christian organisation booked the Law Society's offices in London to hold a conference. And 2 weeks out from the conference, the Law Society cancelled it because they did not want, they said it's incompatible with our values to have anybody who's opposed to same-sex marriage. So they then moved the conference to another major conference centre in London. The day before the conference, remember there's hundreds of people coming, they cancelled the conference because it contradicted their values. So this was a public debate in England about whether and under what circumstances to permit same-sex marriage. Now, in that case, the organisation sued and sued successfully. And both those conference centres had to eat humble pie and acknowledge that they had discriminated, they'd breached the law, they had to apologise. I'm sure they paid damages as well. So the law can sometimes be protective of religious freedom.
So ought we be assured then that there isn't the sort of crossover that affects that separation of powers, that they are separate? Is there any hint that there may be crossovers there? Because sometimes we hear of people who are on the bench in court, whether it's a judge or a magistrate. Really, it's almost as though they're activists against the sorts of positions that Christians hold. Is that something that's just a personally held belief, or is there something here that we ought to be concerned about?
Oh, it's always a hazard. I mean, you get governments from different persuasions who appoint judges. Sometimes they appoint their mates. Sometimes they appoint their ideological fellow travellers. So you may get an unlucky pick as your judge. I'm more concerned, to be honest with you, with the human rights organisations that government has, where sometimes they are very activist and go beyond what the law says. And in my book, I call out in particular the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission for its advice on what the law requires, which goes way beyond, was in contradiction to what the law itself actually says. So law can be used by activists for causes. And I think the Human Rights Commissions are particularly vulnerable to that sort of activist work.
Now, your new book, really an important book, and for listeners, this might be just the one that's going to warn you of some times that are a-changing here in Australia. You've broken it up into 3 parts, Patrick: understanding the problem, law and faith, and when law comes into conflict with ministry. You've tackled a bunch of very important ground here. So it's a little bit of preparation for how do you prepare for times ahead where you might come into conflict with these new things we're talking about now. You've set that out, obviously, with a real intention.
Yeah, look, Neil, the intention is a positive one. The intention is to give people, I hope, wisdom in how to deal with these situations should they face them, particularly for pastors, other Christian leaders, leaders of Christian organizations, leaders of Christian schools. They're going to deal with these issues. And how do we do so wisely? How do we do so in a way which is faithful to our Lord?
Patrick, we all want to live in harmony with others. We want to live a peaceful life. We don't want to have to face all of these sorts of challenges that might come just because we choose to marry and have a family according to a biblical Christian tradition. But that is actually, for a lot of people, becoming less likely. So how do we live peaceably? Do you just pull your head in, or is there an active way that you can promote peace in your community?
Well, a great place to start is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus gave revolutionary teaching on these issues. And he said, look, love your enemies, be kind to those who persecute you, treat everybody with dignity and respect. That's a strong message of the New Testament, isn't it? So the starting point, I think, is that we do treat everybody as best we can, decently and with care for their well-being. And if there are conflicts, we try to resolve them quickly and as peaceably as we can. Now, sometimes that will involve just not insisting on our rights, and Jesus said, if they sue you for your shirt, give them your cloak as well. There are other times when you have to stand up, and it can require a lot of wisdom as to how to do that. But the starting point is that Jesus wants us to live peaceably with others. We should avoid useless quarrels. We're not to engage in culture wars for the sake of it. We're not to align ourselves as if God was on the side of one political cause. That is first and foremost the stance we should take.
Okay, we're taking calls 1800 316 316. You can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Text here says, "Hi Neil, if the law prohibits companies or organisations from removing their staff on the ground of lawful but unethical behaviour, that means the church cannot remove pastors who commit adultery, e.g. the Steve Lawson case. And even in the society, the majority of people have the same standards and expectations for CEOs and leadership in companies. For example, the Coldplay Kiss Cam case. That kind of law is not what Christians and even the majority of people in our society want." So there's a comment there, but is there anything out of what that listener, who appears to be remaining anonymous, is what they're saying? Anything stand out to you, Patrick?
Oh, a huge amount. He's absolutely right. He or she, I should say. What protects us is religious exemptions in anti-discrimination laws. It says there's a carve-out for churches and their pastors. So discipline of a pastor, that's unlikely, won't fall foul of these laws, but a lot of other things will. And we need to be vigilant about opposing governments wanting to extend these laws further and further. We had this in Queensland just before the last election. There were radical and very unwise proposals from the Queensland Human Rights Commission, which the government was prepared to take up. I understand all the churches got together and they made submissions on this, and eventually the government dropped the most controversial of those, and rightly so too. So this is an area of the need always for great vigilance and for churches to work together to protect our religious freedom and to protect our right to hold to our moral standards.
Hey, let's jump to what I think is a very important rubber hits the road point that you make in your book. What to expect when the police come knocking. Now, this might be, a deeply held fear that some have, that one day, because they've said something on social media or they've stepped out of line and said something that might be biblically aligned but not in line with the values in their workplace, that somehow or other they might find themselves with the law knocking at the door. When you talk about the police come knocking, is this something that's an inevitability or is it just a possibility?
Oh, it's just a possibility. And it won't be because you go to church on Sunday, but it could be because of something you've said on social media, which is just reflective of the majority views of most people. Let me give you an example, Neil. There's this particular problem in England. There was a little old lady in her 70s who had the police come knocking at the door. And they said, "You took a photograph." Now, you may say, what of? A nuclear installation, secret nuclear facility? Official secrets of the government? No. She'd taken a photograph of a sticker which was placed over a trans pride poster in her town. And the sticker said, "Keep males out of female spaces." Changing rooms, toilets, and so on. And she was accused of causing alarm and distress because I presume she posted that photograph on social media. But this is how absurd things have become from time to time in England with certain police forces. I haven't heard so much here, but it could happen here.
Will vigilance and talking about these things and challenging our legislators actually make a difference to whether we actually go down the same pathway as maybe the UK or some things we might hear in the US? This vigilance, is this something that we need to take heart and be very mindful of as Australians?
I think absolutely the way to respond to this is to expose it and to tell these stories, because honestly they're quite embarrassing to the police or to the government, and they should be embarrassing. England's got a significant problem, Neil. Very few crimes are resolved in England. About 6% of shoplifting cases ever go to court. And yet we've got police knocking on the doors. There was a case recently where 6 police officers turned up at this journalist's door because of something she had posted on social media. And this is wrong. This is an abuse of power. It's a waste of government resources, police resources. They should be catching the hardened criminals.
Patrick, when it comes to facing challenges like what we're talking about today, you do take some time in your book to note that we as Christian believers have an allegiance to another king. That's why Christians sometimes, no doubt, are perceived to be subversive, because when there is a law and if there is a sinfulness about the law, then we're encouraged to disobey that law because we have an allegiance to God. How important is it to appreciate who God is and who you are as a Christian believer when you're facing times like we're in now? Things are changing.
Yeah, and a lot of the book, or some parts of the book, emphasize how much we should submit to authority, how much we should obey the law, how we should be reluctant to disobey it. And that's an important emphasis, because Paul taught that and Peter taught that, submit to those in authority, because actually none of us want to live in a lawless society. It's chaos. And, crime is rampant on the streets. If you don't have government, you live in a lawless and unsafe world. But having said that, our allegiance is to a higher king, and there will be times for some of us where our allegiance to God has to take precedence over our willingness to obey the law. In those situations, we can quietly not comply. See, Neil, most laws require voluntary compliance by the citizens. And there are some situations where we will withhold our voluntary compliance.
We like the idea of a separation of church and state. And really we can think of the church being something of a conscience that affects the way legislators will make laws. What about the concept of the intrusion of the state into religious activities? I note that in your book you have the story there by which you quote Anthony Fisher, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, who posited a scenario of what might happen. And, when I reflect on what you've written there, he's said the year is 2035, so there's 10 years ahead. Hopefully my last as Archbishop, he says. I've just emailed my draft homily for Sunday to the Religious Safety Commissioner for her approval. Now, we might be outraged that an Archbishop would have to, have their sermon checked before it's preached in church. When you reflect on the sorts of effects that there might be on religious organisations, churches, parachurch organisations, and the way that the state can become very intrusive, are we headed in that direction, do you think?
Archbishop Fisher's speech was a provocation in the sense he wanted to say it could get this bad, and it could. I think that we are heading in the direction where there are no limits on what government can regulate and government can do. And a good example of this is Victoria, which has sought to regulate what we can pray for. And this is just a huge overreach, a silly overreach by the Human Rights Commission in Victoria on these issues. But we need to say now, that's no business of government. And we can be free not to comply. Free in the sense that we have a higher allegiance to God. There may be consequences for not complying. We need to balance the risks and benefits. But we shouldn't assume that governments have the right to govern and regulate every aspect of our lives, including our lives of faith. That's what the Eastern European governments did. That's what the Soviet government did.
Another text from a listener who says, "Hi, how do we find a church in this day and age that is teaching sound doctrine? Too many churches are teaching false doctrines as prosperity gospel and accepting sin in the church and not preaching against sin. It says in Revelation 1:3 that blessed is the one who reads this book. Most churches ignore it." I can pick up in that question there. There's a focus on sometimes churches just rolling over and going with the flow, going with the cultural manoeuvres that are happening, that are being influenced here. Any thoughts for someone with a question like that?
Well, I've lived in many parts of the world, and certainly a number of different parts of Australia. I've always found a biblical fellowship I can join, and I've had a choice of many. So I'm sorry that listener has had that experience. It certainly hasn't been mine. There are many faithful biblical churches. All that said, we do live in a tension between what the Bible said 2,000 years ago, or sometimes 4,000 years ago, and how it applies to our daily lives now. And there is a necessary reevaluation at times of what we understand the Bible to teach in the light of contemporary understanding. Women's ministry, as an example, years ago, it was seen to be fine to have slaves. William Wilberforce, a Christian man, said, no, that's not a Christian way. So we do have to be open to change.
Let's talk about 3 trends that you identify in your book. So for listeners thinking, how bad are things getting now? You're identifying some trends. You can probably find those in your book, but for the conversation here, Patrick, the first trend to believe that traditional moral teaching on sexual behaviour is antithetical to human flourishing. This is one of the trends, clearly, as we're talking about these things around sexuality. But how do you see that as being, in its level of importance?
It's clear we have real conflicts around sexuality, mostly, let's be honest, about LGBTIQI issues. But at the same time, things keep changing. My own view, Neil, is that the sexual revolution has now hit a brick wall. That people who believe in, no constraints on sexual activity other than consent are sometimes finding themselves deeply unhappy, or unable to find fulfilling partnerships. And the Christian teaching about sex, that sex is for a relationship, not a relationship for sex. That is, that sex is part of that longer term thing we want to do, to form a life partnership with somebody, and that sex is something unique to that. This is liberating Christian teaching. So I think we will see that although it's been a source of pressure for us, that the tide may yet turn when people see the wisdom of biblical teaching.
Beautiful wisdom in that. A second trend you identify is to take a very broad view of psychological harm. Yes. In an age of social media and AI on the way, in so many ways having huge effects on us even now. What are your thoughts here, this psychological harm?
I think that it's a concern actually throughout the society that we use the word trauma so freely to refer to minor problems in our lives. Our pet has died, that's trauma. Well, no, I'm sorry, it's not. It's just life and death, which is the cycle that we experience. And I think that psychological harm has been in some cases weaponized by people who say, you can't say that because it may cause people psychological harm. And that is a way to stifle debate. We've seen this in the argument about same-sex marriage, people saying you shouldn't have that debate at all because it may cause harm. We see it in the transgender debate as well. And we have to say, no, we need to have respectful, caring discussion about these issues in which people are free to express their different views. We have to stand against the tyranny of being told that ideas can cause psychological harm and therefore they should be suppressed.
And Patrick, a third trend, and as a legal expert here, your views are very, very important and they are authoritative. A third trend to accept no limits on the power of government to regulate religious organisations, including churches. Thoughts here?
Yes, I mean, there are human rights experts who would even say that the government is entitled to regulate churches' positions on who can be a minister or a priest. The Human Rights Commission in Australia, they put in a ridiculous submission a few years ago to a Senate committee on sex equality. Now, I'm all in favour of sex equality, but I do understand that the Catholic Church has a view that priests must be male. And the view of this Human Rights Commission was that the Australian law should be amended to prohibit the Catholic Church from insisting on its doctrine on a male priesthood. Now, this is simply not up to the government to decide that kind of thing. And so we do see this increasing arrogance, if you like, of governments thinking they can regulate everything and should do.
And so for leaders of our religious denominations, the thought of standing up and saying no further we might be hopeful that there's courage there, because churches coming under the thumb of government, isn't that something that, if you looked at even the experience that you had in your early years under the Soviet Union, where churches are submissive to the government? Do we need some more Christian leaders who will say this far and no further and stand up and courageously be counted?
Well, we do have those brave Christian leaders. Freedom for Faith has been in this space now for 15 years. Just to correct one thing, I'm no longer chair of Freedom for Faith. Okay. I've handed over to somebody much wiser and better than me. But we should stand up. We should call out these attempts to extend the power of government beyond its legitimate means. And I think the other thing is, as I say in the book, quiet non-compliance. Just because it is the law, if it's in conflict with our faith, if it's an overreach by government, or people say it's the law, doesn't mean that we have to just say, oh, well, we must obey everything. We can at times just quietly limit our compliance. We don't make a fuss about it, but we say, well, yes, I'm going to try and comply with as much of this as I can, but there's this bit that I may not get around to complying with.
And isn't that a powerful thought and way we'll need to end our conversation today? Because, right now there's an issue developing around the idea of sovereign citizens with the shooting of a couple of police officers down south and that sort of non-compliance. As Christian believers, we are, in some sense, the model citizens, aren't we? But this quiet non-compliance, because we have an allegiance to a higher king, because we have a motive that wants to see peace and harmony in good relationships, doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. Those things are really, really powerful. Those are sort of supercharged virtues of our Christian faith, aren't they, Patrick? Just as a final word, thoughts there about, being a Christian, not being ashamed of it, because, hey, we've got the answer to what our community would love.
Yeah, I would have no trap with sovereign citizens at all. We are to be model citizens. We are to obey the law. We are to support government. All those things are true, but there are limits to our allegiance where it conflicts with our faith. And the key thing, Neil, is to be very clear when it's a Christian issue and not just a political issue for us or some other issue. We've got to be very, very careful before we say there is a conflict between our faith and what the government wants. There may be, but it may just be we have an argument about vaccinations, or we have an argument about whether President Trump lost the election in 2020. Those are not Christian issues. Okay,
so there are battles, but there are ones that you will choose wisely, and we always love the fact that there's wonderful level heads who are able to give us some direction, and we certainly do appreciate your wisdom today. Emeritus Professor Patrick Parkinson, his new book is called Unshaken Allegiance, Living Wisely as Christians with Diminishing Religious Freedoms. Now, you can connect with Patrick at the Publica website, Publica, Publica.org.au, publica.org.au. The book, again, is Unshaken Allegiance, Living Wisely as Christians with Diminishing Religious Freedoms. It's published by Matthias Media, and it's available places like Koorong, and you can get it at online booksellers as well. Just to mention that Patrick's written many, many books, and books like Australian Family Law in Context, back in 2019. Others that date back, going back a long way now, Tradition and Change in Australian Law, Family Law and Indissolubility of Parenthood, The Voice of a Child in Family Law Disputes, Child Sexual Abuse and the Churches, and Principles of Equity. And I think there are a whole lot of other books as well. But Professor Patrick Parkinson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking some time to share not only your expertise, but also your heart with listeners today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.